In its earliest years, film itself was a special effect. After all, still photographs had only been around for a little over half a century. Prior to that, you had to trust a painter or sculptor to tell you what someone or something looked like. Moving pictures were almost unfathomable. For people in 1903, a man shooting blanks at the camera was almost as terrifying as being shot in real life. People were not accustomed to seeing the world reanimated, but the novelty of oncoming trains could only capture the imagination for so long. Early special effects weren't all that different from what magicians were doing on stage in the late 19th century. Being able to cut and splice a presentation of visual reality was just another form of sleight of hand and misdirection. The French film A Trip to the Moon by, I can't pronounce his name, an actual magician, was at the vanguard of special effects when it was released in 1902, 19 years after the invention of the electric transformer. It wasn't intended to be realistic. Scientists didn't actually think there was a man on the moon, or for that matter, these things, but it was 13 years before Einstein's theory of relativity. Also, people still treated diseases with mercury and gave morphine to teething babies. As movies transitioned from penny arcade novelty to a bankable industry, the visual trickery became more elaborate. In 1916, a year before America entered the Great War, D.W. Griffith made Intolerance, which presented one of the most popular techniques in special effects during the latter half of the silent era, building insanely massive sets at a considerable financial and human cost. Want to know how they made this set of ancient Babylon so convincingly enormous? They actually just built it that way, and lots of people got hurt. Same thing with DeMille's first crack at the Ten Commandments in 1923. DeMille said, "We don't fake anything in pictures. We've got to have the real thing." So, there you go. This was 11 years before the enactment of the Fair Labor Standards Act. This kind of thing couldn't go on forever. Fritz Lang's Metropolis, a depiction of a horrific industrial dystopia from 1927, was so vast that it could not be constructed full-size with its meager budget of 7 million Reichmarks. Miniatures, projections, animation, mirror tricks, every possible visual effect that filmmakers had learned in the vast, over 30-year history of moving pictures was employed. Technology had advanced exponentially by the end of the Great War. Automobiles were permanently replacing horses. Humans could now launch objects into the stratosphere with guns that kind of looked like this. The bleak vision of the industrial world presented in Metropolis was, ironically, impossible to produce without the advances of the bleak industrial world. By the 1930s, the startling pace of technological advancement had itself become a subject of interest. Futurism was all the rage. If we had gone from horses and wagons to transatlantic flight over the course of a middle-aged person's lifetime, what kind of insane wonders were in store? H.G. Wells hated the future presented in Metropolis. He thought the robots and massive buildings were balderdash. Wells's film, Things to Come, aimed to create a terrifying world of the future more grounded in the realities of recent history, the fear of causing our own destruction, the new possibilities and new horrors that accompany new inventions, and of course, pure fetishization of the world of the future, which was lovingly rendered with designs from some of the premier avant-garde artists of the time. People were right to fear the future in 1936. 3 years later, the Nazis would invade Poland, and things got a bit out of hand. The outbreak of war in Europe caused the producers of an English fantasy film to shift production from England to California. The Thief of Baghdad was the most influential special effects film until the advent of CGI. According to Roger Ebert, there are few effects in Star Wars that were not invented for, experimented with, or perfected in The Thief of Baghdad. This was the complete book of tricks for the next 4 decades. All effects were still applied in the shot, the editing, or directly to the film. The trick to the next several decades would be to use these processes for increasingly realistic effect. This is how we skipped from the cheesiness of the Cold War doomsday parable When Worlds Collide to the impeccable exacting beauty of 2001: A Space Odyssey in just 17 years. During that time, the double helix was discovered. More importantly for us, transistors replaced vacuum tubes in the mid-50s, and the evolution of computers took off, becoming the cornerstone of a technological revolution that would shortly put a man on the moon for real just a year after 2001 staged it. Before computers took over every aspect of visual effects, they aided with the techniques that had already been developed, making them more precise and efficient. While 70s disaster films were still using the same mock-ups and matte paintings that had been around for, 70 years, Star Wars came along and shifted shifted the concept of what was possible. Computers were used to sync up motion-controlled cameras, which made complex movements and special effects shots a possibility. This was a technique that became indispensable for the next 2 decades of special effects. Even more important than that, however, was this simple 3D wireframe of the Death Star Trench, the first extensive use of CGI in film. It was the beginning of the end of the techniques that had been used since Metropolis, which had been released 17 years before George Lucas was born. CGI took over gradually. In the beginning, it needed to be used for a very specific purpose. Futuristic animations, guys made of glass, water tentacles, that kind of thing. At this time, computers themselves were still used for very specific purposes. Word processing, accounting, crappy games. The internet didn't exist as far as most people were concerned, but as the technology became more comprehensive and requisite to our lives, the use of computers and special effects became more common. It makes all the sense in the world. As computers got better, CGI got better, and eventually it was used to create entire characters and even worlds from whole cloth. The interesting thing is, nobody really wants to go back to a time before the internet and smartphones, but there is currently a wave of enthusiasm for old-school visual effects, best exemplified by the many real constructions of The Force Awakens, the authenticity of Mad Max Fury Road, and the films of Michel Gondry. All of these examples still employ extensive use of computers, but they also try to keep the central imagery as tangible, as real as possible. And that's the thing about magic. We know it's all just tricks and illusions, but in the moment, we still want to believe.